Now we should actually stop recording, right? And my colleague, Dr. Syed Hossein Zarhani, who actually comes from Iran, but is now a citizen of Germany, and he's lived in and grown up in Iran, as well as spent a couple of years in India before he came to do a PhD here. So we are now just one person we are missing right now is Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar, but he did tell me that he will come at 10 minutes past 2, and we will begin at 15 minutes past 2.
Prof, we will record if you could just announce that we will record.
Would you, what would you think? Is it a good idea to record this meeting? Or do you think that this meeting should not be recorded? I mean, I think we can go either ways.
I have no objection to recording.
Yeah, it seems good. We can record.
Does anybody have any objection to recording this meeting? So in that case, I think, Mia, we can record the meeting and then put it up on the website. Torunda, is it all right to record the meeting? Would you like to?
Yeah, I think we should record. We always record our meetings.
Okay,
and yeah, it's good to record because, I have told some of our researchers to do a story based on that. So we'll also be putting it on our website tomorrow.
Excellent.
So it's good to always refer to the recordings in case of, to check on quotes, etc.
Excellent. So I think no one is really opposed to the idea of recording, but typically our seminars begin at 2:15. So I would still think that we have to wait for another 5 minutes before Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar comes in, and I guess others start coming in. Commodore Bhaskar, are there certain things that you would like to discuss right now before we begin the meeting?
I, would just repeat what I had said to our panelists, and I'll say this when our Pakistani colleague joins. But I had sent a mail to all the members on the panel to say that if it's okay by you, can we restrict the opening remarks to between 10 to 12 minutes? And what I thought I would do more in terms of keeping an eye on the clock is that when you reach 10 minutes, I'll give you an alert to say that please wrap up in 2 more minutes so that you can marshal your thoughts accordingly. That's the first administrative kind of suggestion. And I don't want to interrupt you. So if you just look at my screen or the postage stamp, I just put up 2 fingers, like this to give you a sign of number 2 so that you know that you have 2 more minutes in the unlikely event that I need to alert you. Otherwise, I'm sure all of you are seasoned, you know how to time yourselves. The second minor observation is that to the extent possible, I've said this to some of you bilaterally. I think if you look at the participants, we now have 28, and I think all of them are black belts in terms of the region, Afghanistan, and so on. So as experts, as panelists, perhaps you might want to look at the way ahead and offer your interpretation or recommendation in the light of whatever has happened from September 1st, including the last 2 meetings that we've had in Delhi and the Troika Plus in Islamabad, and any other development that you think would be relevant in terms of policy. So these are suggestions. Otherwise, frankly, I leave it to you all to use your 10 or 12 minutes in the manner that you deem appropriate. Because if you look at the list of the 28 people who are already on board, now it's 29. I recognize many names, and I think they're all old Afghan hands or South Asia watchers in different ways. So I think you have a very, I'm looking forward to the discussion after the panelists make their formal remarks. So that's all the housekeeping from my side, Rahul. If anybody has any points from the panelists, please feel free to weigh in.
Yeah, so the way it's going to work is that all our panelists are in minus Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar. I am expecting him to come in any moment. At 2:15 sharp, I will formally introduce the moderator, who will be Commodore Uday Bhaskar, and the speakers. And then the floor will be sort of chaired by Commodore Bhaskar, and he will sort of review the speaking time as well as the question answer, make his own comments. And then after everything ends, I'll just maybe make a short mention by way of thanking everybody. So it'll be a few minutes. See, Asim has come in. Hello, Asim. Can you turn your video on?
I'm about to try, yes.
Super.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. I'm on it.
Asim is just coming in from a class that he has finished delivering. So he is just on time.
Okay, I'm having trouble with the video. Maybe should I log in and log out while you guys start, or?
Sure, you can log in, log out. That won't take much time.
Yeah.
And
Give me a minute.
I will wait for you to try and log in again.
I'm
we'll
doing
start. Yeah.
Right now. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Before I begin the introduction, and while Asim is still coming on, I can see some of my students, but I should certainly make a mention of my colleagues who are also helping me with this session. There is Dr. Himanshu Jha, who is a lecturer and research fellow in my department. Yes, Asim, wonderful. So we can see you as well.
Yes, great. Sorry.
There is Mr. Mustafizur Rahman, who is a research associate in the department. There is Ms. Tanvi Deshpande, who is also a research associate in the department and a Marie Curie fellow. There is Mr. Jaishankar Prasad, who is also a Marie Curie fellow and a research associate in the department. And I can also see Dr. Bernhard Beitelmeier-Berini, who is an adjunct lecturer in my department. He's teaching a class on Indian foreign policy. So I think all the academic members of the department are in, and I can also see many students who are in. So with that, we can begin the introduction, the formal introduction. And I will go with the caveat that many of our speakers really need no introduction, but just to highlight for those who do not know who our speakers are and where they come from, I think it's worthy of mention. So as I have mentioned in the informal session, that Commodore Uday Bhaskar will be the chair of this session as soon as I end introducing the speakers, and then I will deliver a vote of thanks and maybe a few comments. He retired from the Indian Navy in 2007. One of India's leading strategic analysts, Commodore Bhaskar, was the deputy director of the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis between 1990 and 2004. And many of you who know about Indian strategic thinking and the Institute of Defense and Strategic Analysis, you know that there was one director for a long period of time. And Commodore Bhaskar was the deputy director. Thereafter, I think he became officiating director in 2004-05. Later, he was secretary of the Government of India's Task Force on Global Strategic Developments. Editor of Maritime Affairs and Strategic Analysis for many years. Presently, he is on the board of editors of Contemporary Security Policy. His numerous papers have been published by the US Naval Institute Proceedings, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and his chapters have appeared in volumes published by the US Naval War College, the Royal Navy Defense Studies, and anybody who follows strategic issues in India knows and reads the columns that he writes. I personally think that it is, so I can tell you that there is a website called Galileo, which covers some of the best opinion pieces on India. And it also has a kind of tradition of being somewhat left of center. Often his opinion pieces are among the choicest pieces that are in the choice of the editors. That's actually quite an honor. I must then introduce, in order of seniority, Ambassador Rakesh Sood. We are really, really very, very fortunate to have him amongst us today. Distinguished fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. Many of you who know about the Observer Research Foundation would know that they conduct the Raya Sinha dialogues, which are funded by the Ministry of External Affairs. He has served Brussels, Dakar, Geneva, Islamabad, was Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, set up the Disarmament and International Security Affairs Division within the Ministry of External Affairs, and led it till about 2008. He was concerned with multilateral negotiations with Pakistan, bilateral negotiations with Pakistan, strategic dialogues with the United States, United Kingdom, and France, and Israel. Many of you must have heard about the ASEAN Regional Forum, which is a security forum in the ASEAN region that also attracts strategic analysts from the rest of the world. He is engaged with the ASEAN Regional Forum. He was the first permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament at the United Nations in Geneva. He was the United Nations Secretary General's Disarmament. He was on the Disarmament Advisory Board between 2002 and 3, served as ambassador to France 2011 to 13, Nepal 2008 to 11, and was ambassador to Afghanistan, last but not the least, between 2005 and 2008. So we really have not only a distinguished strategic expert moderating the panel, but one of India's most distinguished diplomats participating in it. I was just cracking a joke with my friend, Dr. Jonah Blank. He is one of the most unusual people that you will meet. And let me highlight why he is unusual. Studied history at Yale, PhD in anthropology from Harvard, 1998, learned Sanskrit, Hindi, Gujarati, and Urdu. His first book is Arrow of the Blue-Skinned God, Retracing the Ramayana Through India. He then worked on the Dawoodi Bohra Muslim community, which led to a book titled Mullahs on the Mainframe. This is a book that highlights the fact that a Muslim community in India has a fairly modern way of approaching life. He has been on the staff of the United States World and News Report, has published in the New Yorker and Foreign Affairs. Later, he also became a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's been a senior political scientist at RAND. And I learned just recently that he is in Singapore, where I was approximately 5 years ago, working with the Middle East Institute. And there too, he's working closely with one of Singapore's very distinguished diplomats, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. So certainly a very, very important person who's looking at I wouldn't have been surprised if he was advising Senator Biden when he was in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Actually, if I could interject, yes, actually, I was the Afghanistan point person for Senator Biden from 1999 until 2009.
So
and after that for John Kerry when he was chairman of foreign relations. So on this topic, when related to Afghanistan, at least those, I guess, are my bona fides.
So you can see how lucky we are to have Jonah today. And having advised Biden in an earlier day and age, we would like to hear about how he feels now. Then we have Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar, a dear friend, an erudite scholar who also has a fairly active political life, got his degrees, BA and MA in economics from, I think, Northwestern and Yale, respectively, and then a PhD in political sociology from SOAS. And the result of that was that he is one of the few very serious and deep thinkers about the evolution of the state in Pakistan, starting with the work of Hamza Alawi. And some of the things that he has written, we teach in our classes here in Heidelberg. He is now an associate professor of political economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at Quaid-e-Azam University. He has a political life. He was the coordinator of the People's Rights Movement from 2002 to 12. And he was president of the Awami Workers' Party, I think the Punjab Executive Committee from 2014 to 2020. So once again, we have a very interesting person who leads a very democratic life, working with forces in Pakistan in a manner that he feels will uplift the country. Then, of course, we are very, very delighted to have a scholar who has lived in Afghanistan, Dr. Omar Suther. He is the author of Negotiating Cultural Diversity in Afghanistan, published by Routledge in 2020, assistant professor of political science at the American University in Afghanistan. Previously, he was senior researcher at the Afghanistan Institute for Strategic Studies. He has been researcher at the Department of Peace Studies, located within the National Center for Policy Research. Now, if I'm making any mistakes, Omar, you may correct. Like Jonah, if there's something you want to add, which will help people get a better perspective from where you're coming, but if you think I've got you right, then I will move on to the next speaker.
Thank you. That's all.
Good. And last but not the least, my colleague, Dr. Syed Hossain Zarhani, who was born and grew up in Iran. He's not only a PhD in political science from Heidelberg University, worked under my predecessor in my department, and he's doing serious work on the political economy of India, including some of the crony capitalism that is evolving within the Indian state. But his knowledge of Dari, Persian, and his acute interest in the evolution of things in Afghanistan, I felt from his perspective would be very, very important for us to know, because Afghanistan, as we know, has different parts, and one of those parts is Persian, and people who know Persian and Dari can follow things that might be of great significance for this particular gathering. So there we have now, and Commodore Bhaskar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, depending on your time zones. And before I make my brief remarks, I just have one administrative request. Would you kindly put your cell phones or landlines on mute, or whatever be the appropriate option that you might like to exercise. And the second is, if you have any pets that decide to join in this panel, they are welcome. I think most of us in the last 18, 20 months of COVID-induced webinars are familiar with pets deciding odd, small children perhaps, but this is a friendly chat, so feel free. But on a more serious note, greetings to everybody. And I want to acknowledge what Professor Rahul Mukherjee has just said, and the South Asia Monitor, the Society for Policy Studies, is very glad to partner SAI, the South Asia Institute in the University of Heidelberg. And we've had some very productive bilateral chats with Professor Mukherjee, and we hope to take this forward in the next few months and years ahead. So I want to again place on record that for SAM, South Asia Monitor, this is a very valuable association. Now, one minor sort of additional point. Rahul has given me a very generous introduction, and I think it reads more like an obituary. So I want to apologize for that. Many of the things stated there are factually correct, but I think the emphasis perhaps may not be as valid. It's very generous. Thank you, Rahul. A minor factual correction: I no longer am actively associated with any of the journals that were listed. For instance, something like Contemporary Security Policy. I was on the editorial board. I no longer am. I have a Rip Van Winkle status. So, but again, thank you for mentioning all those points. Now, as far as our discussion today is concerned, the panel discussion, I think Rahul has already given a very detailed introduction of our eminent panelists. In lighter vein, I had sent an email to all of them and I said, "Dear Black Belt." And after hearing Rahul's detailed introduction, I think it's more than warranted. It's a very experienced, and I think, we have 4 universities. It's a trapeze. If you look at the way in which the universities, and as I look at them, we have Professor Omar Suther, who's currently in the US at the University of Pennsylvania. We have Professor Asim, who is in Islamabad, Pakistan. We have Dr. Jonna Blank, who's currently NUS, Singapore. And we have Rahul's colleague, Dr. Zarhani, who's in the University of Heidelberg, and a very experienced diplomat in Ambassador Rakesh Sood. So I think this is a very, very, I would say, rich kind of gene pool to look at the issues in Afghanistan. I want to acknowledge all the participants who are on board. I mean, as I see it now, we have 37 of them. I know most of them, not all of them. I want to say hello through cyber to many friends whom I have known over the last 20 years, if not more. People who have, I think, enriched the discourse on South Asia, on matters pertaining to security and strategic issues, literally, I would say, since the end of the Cold War. So thank you for being here. I hope that we would be able to engage in a useful discussion. Now, most of us have been tracking Afghanistan. It's a tragedy in more ways than one. Some of us recall events of late 1979, when the Soviet Union had walked into Afghanistan, and all, I would say, the developments that followed, peaking in a tragic way with what happened on August 31st this year. From then to now, it's roughly about 4.5 months. And we've had 2 major, I would say, policy initiatives within the region. One is the Regional Security Dialogue in Delhi, and the other, of course, is the Troika Plus in Islamabad. This is against the backdrop of a mounting humanitarian tragedy. I think most of us are in touch with friends, colleagues in Afghanistan, either directly or through various other links that we have. And whatever little bit I have heard has been heartrending. I do have occasion to interact with some groups in India that are working with women and children, and that really is the most vulnerable sector now. But these are live issues, and whatever be the deliberations at the political diplomatic level, they have to translate, I think, to mitigate what is happening. So I've requested our panelists that in the time that is available to them, we are looking at 10 to 12 minutes for each panelist. 5 of them, so that will take us to about an hour, and then we'll have a little time for our discussion to focus on, to the extent possible, the way ahead. And whatever they may wish to offer, this is a meeting that's being recorded. It will also be put up on our websites in different ways. We at the South Asia Monitor and SPS are very keen that policymakers should be apprised of some of the bullets, some of the takeaways from here. So it's in that spirit that I invite our panelists, and we'll go in the same order that Professor Mukherjee has identified. So Professor Omar Suther, can I request you, sir, to go first? And then I'll request the others in that order. Omar, all yours. You might want to put your mics on mute, those of you who are not speaking. It will help us with the audio. And whenever you want to come on, you can switch on your mics. I'm muting myself. Omar, all yours.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning to everyone. It's really an honor to participate and be along with the quite distinguished panelists and speakers. I want to talk over two things. One is the current crisis in Afghanistan, the nature of it, to unpack some of the dimensions on that respect. Second is the question of Taliban, their nature, and whether they can rule and govern. On the first one, I think it's very, very critical moment for Afghanistan. It has been almost 100 days that Afghanistan has been controlled by Taliban. And the country since then has fallen into a multidimensional crisis. The very first one is, I think, political crisis, and that is crisis of legitimacy on the side of people. The Taliban has not been able to establish their legitimacy either because of the lack of ability to deliver services. Whether this is security, the Taliban has failed to present security as what it was assumed, and many people welcome probably Taliban in the region, saying that Taliban might establish certain form of control, which might, for example, counter ISKP and other regional terrorist networks. However, what happened in the last 3 months clearly shown that Taliban has failed to deliver on the security, multiple numerous suicide attacks, targeting minorities like Shias in Kunduz and Kandahar, and as well as other communities in Jalalabad has shown, and in Kabul has shown, that Taliban failed to establish control and deliver security. Of course, on the issue of services, the Taliban does not have any bureaucratic and technocratic abilities to provide, for example, when it comes to justice, when it comes to mega services like power, water, electric, or many other things. Like in terms of educations, their policies are still harsh. So in that case, the Taliban, of course, face crisis of legitimacy domestically. Internationally, so far, no one has recognized Taliban. Certain countries, of course, continue to engage with the Taliban. Some others who were vocal to push the international community to engage with the Taliban, for instance, Prime Minister Imran Khan of Pakistan has continuously persuaded the international community to engage with the Taliban. Of course, the West also has certain regions in order to keep in touch with the Taliban, and that is either to have access to information or certain form of leverage. But at the same time, it is also cautiously decided that if they abandon Taliban, as it was, as it happened in the 90s, that will radicalize further the Taliban. So that's why, as a kind of medium level of engagement has been there with the Taliban, however, no formal recognition so far. That is on political dimension. On economic dimension, I think we are well aware that country is in free fall. Around $9.4 billion assets of the country are frozen. In the United States, international financial institutions like IMF and World Bank has stopped loans. Financial task force has warned many countries, member countries, to block Taliban assets. Some of the essential household goods or critical goods, for example, food or fuel, are going, or in terms of price, they are skyrocketing. Around 80% of electricity of the country is important, around 20 to 40% of wheat, or for example, the same as nearly all fuel is important, and the price are really skyrocketing. Local currency is depreciated. I think just yesterday it went 5 Afghanis high to at $1 is now 95 Afghani. So really, that's also another dimension of economic crisis. And finally, the Taliban, and again, as I mentioned, in terms of political dimension, in terms of economic policies, whether it's fiscal or monetary, they don't have technocratic and bureaucratic capacity to manage the country. That's on one hand. On the other hand, they have also purged many who are willing to stay in the country and work with the Taliban. Unfortunately, some of them were kicked out of the government. So that I think Taliban will clearly fail on this, and unfortunately, that will lead to another crisis, and that's already has done, which is a humanitarian crisis, where people have been suffering because of lack of access to liquidity, to money, but also unemployment has a kind of unfold a kind of double crisis. And as winter is approaching, I think many people will not have access to basic food, fuel, and other things. And this will, of course, intensify the humanitarian catastrophe in the country. So these are the 4 catastrophic dimensions that Afghanistan is facing now. The second issue, I think, is that the question of whether Taliban can govern, or probably will the Taliban survive, as many may assume, right? Well, Taliban so far, as many analysts, the dominant literature, some of the policy analysts who has studied Taliban in the last 20 years, tells us that, well, they have been governing certain rural areas of Afghanistan through informal institutions, through the networks that they had, and, for example, in small scale services, for example, how they manage education institutes at the village and villages and the rural areas, or, for example, in terms of justice sector, how people were approaching them as the republics and institutions were corrupt, and people did not trust the previous governments. Now, I think we can assess Taliban's possible ability of governance, or whether they will survive on certain other indicators that some of them I mentioned. But the first one is how they will manage security. I think one of the most significant threat to the Taliban will come from within, in the rank and file. First of all, I think Taliban should make sure, in order to survive, that to keep all the rank and file intact, both ideologically, but also, I think, administratively and financially. As Taliban are facing crisis in terms of their capacity to pay, so most of their rank and file who have not been paid in the last couple of minutes, they are shifting line and their allegiances to other terrorist groups where they are paid higher. That's number one. Secondly, some of the radical factions within the Taliban have been dissatisfied with the way things have unfolded in the last 3 months. So that's why they have also tried to shift their allegiances to much more radical groups like ISKP.
You have 2 more minutes to wrap up.
Okay. That's in terms of their capacity to remain intact and how to counter armed opposition against themselves. Second issue would be governance, and in terms of governance, Taliban does not have any ability, and I think we will face a period of crisis as Afghanistan did in 1996, where, of course, international community doesn't have any choice except to have certain form of leverage. But I think at the moment it's quite difficult for international community to intervene in Afghanistan. That it's not right moment to come back, and so that's why I suppose in terms of crisis of governance, Afghanistan will face a kind of medium period of 2 to 3 years if it remains under Taliban, a kind of pariah state, where it will not abide to any rule of international community, and it will not be recognized by the international community. And the final thing is the Western engagement. There are various challenges towards engagement of the West. Of course, there are issues related to human rights, women's rights, and pluralism, which Taliban clearly violate those. But when it comes to other issues which are related to security and counterterrorism, the West will continue to engage with the Taliban in order to hold them accountable. But of course, what's clear here is that Taliban could not be trusted by their words. Rather, Taliban should be held accountable in terms of what they deliver. So the metric will be their behavior and policies rather than what they assert. I will stop here, and probably I will come back for the questions.
Thank you, Professor Omar, for your remarks. I think they've been very lucid. And given your own perch, I think you have your ear to the ground when it comes to Afghanistan. And I think you've given us a very graphic kind of description of the various challenges. And the operative part is, can the Taliban govern effectively? And on that note, I think this is a very good entry point for Dr. Asim Sajjad Akhtar. Pakistan has a very special role to play, and we are aware about the various statements that came out of the Troika Plus. So I'll request Dr. Akhtar to make his remarks, and then we'll move on. Dr. Akhtar, all yours.
Thank you very much, and to Rahul and the entire organizing team for having me, and to also be sharing this platform with the rest of you. Yes, certainly, as you noted, any discussion of the sort of re-takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban remains incomplete without mention of Pakistan and its role, which also is reflected in, as was just pointed out, the fact that despite Islamabad not having formally recognized the Taliban regime, it is clearly the closest thing to an advocate for the Taliban regime that you will find anywhere in the world. So there's no two ways about that. But I will very briefly, before I get to sort of which I think will be my primary contribution, is to sort of outline the extent to which this sort of, in some ways, popular notion that the Taliban, in a sense, is a proxy for Pakistan, the extent to which that is actually correct, how much it has been in the past, and how much it can be expected to be in the future. And also some comments I'd like to add to what Omar said about the Taliban's, in some ways, social base, to the extent that it enjoys one. But I will say, just before either of those two sort of bits, that I think, Omar ended a bit with some impressions on the role of the West or the Western world in Afghanistan. I think that it is worth just sort of stating at the outset, and I very much hold to this opinion, that sort of the entire 20 years of the so-called war on terror has basically been a shambles. And I think that sort of the question of Pakistan's role, and I will be very blunt about that role, must be placed within the larger context of the NATO-led effort and the US-led effort. Whether anything from things like the curtailment of opium production to generally questions of governance and security and the kinds of metrics that Omar rightfully pointed out that the Taliban regime will be measured by. frankly, 20 years of US supported government in Afghanistan failed quite miserably on most of those metrics as well. And I think that there's just no two ways about the fact that this is as I think Commodore pointed out right at the outset, that this is a story that has to be traced back, not just to 2001, not just to 96, but at least 20 years even further back. And I would argue, and this will bring me to Islamabad's particular role, that 1979 and the Red Army entering Afghanistan is not the starting point. The starting point is much further back. I could go back into the 1920s, frankly, but just to sort of bring into focus Pakistan's role, it certainly starts as early as 1973. When the sort of original band of Afghan Islamists were explicitly patronized by the Pakistani establishment against the then King Daud's regime. And there was no Red Army, there was no Soviet invasion on the horizon then. This was part of what many of you will know in the strategic community is Pakistan's long desired objective of securing strategic depth, which has to do with its narrow geographical sort of, or at least what remained of Pakistan after 1971 and East Pakistan secession. So a friendly regime in Kabul, which at the very least was not hostile to Islamabad, and there was many things going on in 1973, not least of all the fact that a fairly pro or close to the Afghan regime at the time, National Awami Party government in both Balochistan and at that point, what was called the Northwest Frontier Province, today Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, was in power. And shortly around the same time, the Balochistan National Awami Party government had been forcibly dissolved by the then People's Party regime. So there's a long story of Afghan Islamists or of Islamists active in Afghanistan being patronized by the Pakistani establishment, and it long precedes sort of the popular story of, well, when the Soviets wanted to get close to warm waters is when Pakistan's part in this story begins. However, of course, the ante was upped after the Saur Revolution of '78. And crucially, of course, Ziaul Haq has come to power a few months before that. Ziaul Haq, as you know, becomes the blue-eyed boy of Washington in prosecuting the jihad and so on. That story doesn't need to be told here again. But I think it is important to put this all into context because when what happens post 96 or 96 onwards very much follows from the series of geopolitical wranglings placed within the context of the Cold War, certainly. But a lot of that, there's a lot of continuity there at the end of the Cold War as well. Briefly, just I think it's one important point I think to bear in mind. Again, most of you will know that the Taliban are a distinct entity from the original Afghan Mujahideen. At least some of them are very much products of refugee camps in Peshawar. They're of a different generation from the Hikmatyars and the Rabbanis and the Saifs that gestated around the campus of Kabul University. So this is a different beast. Not all of the Taliban are trained or gestated in Pakistan, but a significant segment of the rank and file do, which I think, of course, therefore gives wind to this notion that they are a proxy for Islamabad. But what I will say, because I know I won't have that much time, there's lots I could sink my teeth into here. What I will say is that I think the evidence suggests that the Taliban today are also a different entity from the Taliban of 1996. And I think that the extent to which Pakistan exercises influence over the Taliban, of course, would require us to get into some of those factional struggles that Omar reflected on. Not least of all, the faction known as the Haqqani network, which is gestated in and around the Waziristan tribal agency on the border with Afghanistan. being popularly known, of course, during a lot of arm twisting during the Obama years. The Haqqani network came up time and again that you need to cut these guys down to size, otherwise we're going to cut, otherwise we're going to freeze the coalition support funds, so on and so forth. There was a lot of wrangling around that, which is why I said the whole enterprise was a bit of a shambles, because of course, in 2021, when the pullout happens, it is very much the Haqqani network is front and center of the the Taliban regime that comes back into power in Kabul. But the Haqqani network is only one of different factions, and I think to overplay the extent to which Pakistan controls the Taliban, I think is something we do at our own peril. Interestingly, just on an aside, after what was in Pakistani circles, and I think it is worth bearing in mind that within the intelligentsia, within the mainstream media, there was a great deal of celebration almost with the events of 15th August 2021, the rather dramatic events. But of course,
sir, you have 2 minutes. I'm sorry for.
I'm winding up. But subsequent to that, and then some of you will have followed that of course the genie out of the bottle has haunted Pakistan itself for a long time now. And whether that be what is called the Tehreek-e-Taliban within Pakistan, which is sort of reasserting itself with full force, or a rather more novel form of militancy associated with the Barelvi sect, something called the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which is over the last 4 or 5 years really exploded onto the mainstream. So these are some of the things that I think within the Pakistani establishment are also really sort of push back against this notion that there is a sort of a uniform and almost uninhibited sort of in some ways strategic logic to backing the Taliban to the hilt. The last thing, very briefly, was what I wanted to talk about with regards to the Taliban enjoying, let's say, for lack of a better word, some kind of social network. And I think that again demands some historical parallels. The PDPA regime historically failed to establish meaningful sources of support within rural Afghanistan. I think that really a similar sort of story, albeit with very different accents, was what happened with the US-backed Kabul regime for the best part of 20 years. I think that story will continue to reassert itself in Afghanistan's present and future until and unless we have some kind of broad-based regional agreement where the so-called great game stops guiding how regional sort of powers engage with Afghanistan, and there is something beyond the very bare bones skeletal Kabul and then the rest of Afghanistan, which is in some ways left to its own devices almost. And in a worst case scenario, we keep having these 20-year cycles of rural insurgencies, partially backed by regional powers. And I think that is the long run story where you get a different outcome from the one we've just observed. Of course, Pakistan is front and center, but so is India, so is Iran, so is China and Russia, and of course, so is the US, certainly. That Pakistan will have to move beyond strategic depth is something that progressives in Pakistan have long advocated for at their own peril, and we continue to do so. But I don't think that is sufficient. I think there has to be a regional commitment, and that notwithstanding, I fear that the kinds of situations that Afghan people are facing in this winter could extend beyond just the next 3 or 4 months. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. And I also want to apologize to all our panelists. All of you are experts who, quote unquote, know too much. And to use a local, phrase that is familiar in the subcontinent, it's almost as if you're just getting into the alap and the time is over. But this is the tyranny of time. But I hope we'll have enough, space for you to come back later. Thanks, Dr. Akhtar. You made some useful points about Pakistan. I'm repeating the administrative request. Those of you who are not speaking, please unmute or mute rather and come back when you need to speak. I can hear some faint music. I don't know where it came from, but those of you who are not speaking, please be on the mute mode. May I now request Dr. Syed Zarhani to make his remarks from the University of Heidelberg. Dr. Zarhani, all yours.
Thank you so much. May I use my PowerPoint and share my screen? So, hello everyone. It's my pleasure and honor to be able to present and discuss my ideas. Actually, today what I want to do is to discuss one of understated issues in terms of the current political situation in Afghanistan. This is the role of Islamic Republic of Iran in the current political development in Afghanistan. Actually, we heard a point of view of Dr. Suther about the internal and domestic dynamics, especially after Taliban, and also Dr. Akhtar's view on Pakistan. Let's now talk about the other regional player who played a very significant role in the current situation in Afghanistan. So actually what we can think about, talking about two versions of political Islam, Islamic Republic versus Islamic Emirate. And what we want to do is to understand the transformation of Iran-Taliban relation after 2003. So let's begin with two statements that actually I quoted them from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is the final decision maker in terms of Iran's foreign policy. Look at the first quote. It is something a part of one speech that he delivered in June 3rd, 2004, means that after the invasion of US to Afghanistan, he talked about Taliban. So the enemies of Islamic revolution, I mean Iran's revolution, headed by United States, completely wrong versions of Islamic State. The version turned to a Taliban government and turned into a funny and ridiculous caricature. So compare this statement with the current statement of the Supreme Leader, 2021 October, actually just 2 weeks ago. And when he talked about Afghanistan, and he talked about the security of Shia citizens in Afghanistan, I say that we need to formulate plans. One way to prevent these incidents, terrorist incidents, for the current honorable Afghan officials to go to the mosques themselves. So who are these honorable Afghan officials? The current Afghan government in Kabul, means Taliban. Although Iran did not recognize Taliban as a de jure recognition, rather we have a kind of de facto recognition by Iran. Of course, it is not on the paper, it is not official, but we have some interesting documents and we have some interesting evidence that actually can be really interesting for our audience. So how we can explain this transformation, ridiculous caricature to honorable officials? To understand the change, let's look at the history. Actually, we cannot understand the current situation without looking at the past. Let's look at August 8, 1998. Actually, as you can see, it is Persian, but I'll explain what are they. Two iconic pictures related to the killing of Iranian so-called diplomats in Afghanistan in Iran's general consulate in Mazar Sharif, 1998. The right, if you look at right, then you can see the picture of Iranian diplomats, officials, members of Revolutionary Guards, Quds Force, who had been killed by Taliban forces in 1998 when they captured the city of Mazar Sharif. And in the left side, you can see Iran newspaper, the official newspaper of Iran's government. So the first title from the supreme leader announced unified anger against Taliban. Here, Taliban shooted thinking and awareness. And here, Hashemi Rafsanjani, the second strongman in Iran at the time, Iran cannot forget the blood of citizens, and we will want strong revenge. So this is actually the context of the relation between two nations in 1998. So Taliban as a symbol of Sunni Islamism, supported by Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Emirates, recognized by them. And Iran actually supported at that time what we know as the North Alliance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud. And Iran and Taliban actually in 1998 went on the verge of the war. Iran sent the troops on the border, and finally Iran decided to just show a maneuver of power and return. 3 years later, after killing of Ahmad Shah Massoud, 2 days before, 11 September 2011, Iran gathered all of jihadi leaders, North Alliance, and talked about the possible revenge. So let's come back to the next point. So in the post-2003, we have a change. So Taliban had been removed, and we have a new government in Afghanistan. I don't want to talk about the historical events, but there are some interesting points. Iran had 6 important objectives in the foreign policy in Afghanistan. Number 1, US troops and security concerns. So if you look at geopolitical position of Iran, the West, we had Iraq occupied by American troops. In the South, we have the Persian Gulf and Navy, and in the East, here, Afghanistan. So I think the most significant goal. The second issue was the Salafism and Jihadism as an alternative and rival narrative of political Islam. Third, drug trafficking and organized crime. Next issue was refugees and migration, because Iran had more than 3 million refugees migrated from Afghanistan, and Iran wanted to find a solution to return them or get some financial resource. Hirmand River, very important water resource on the Sistan and Balochistan region of Iran, and water resources that actually the Afghan government built a dam on the river, and Iran needed more water resources. And finally, Shia Muslim Persian language. The next phase of Iran-Taliban relation actually is related to the first issue here, US troops and security. Iran began to kind of political rapprochement with Taliban. How? During 2004, 2005, 6 onwards, there is an incremental change in Iran's foreign policy. Number
Dr.
one.
Zarani, you have just 2 more minutes, I'm afraid.
Good, yeah, I'm actually at the final stage. Iran actually connected to some religious leaders like Sami ul-Haq, that is well known in Pakistan, invited him to Iran and talking about Islamic unity, also connecting to Taliban leader Mullah Mansour Akhtar and supporting them in terms of intelligence, finance, to help to create a united front against United States. Also, the new enemy, the ISIS, that actually provided the new alternative understanding of political Islam. So actually, Iran used Iraq experience to push American forces. You know what they have done with Jaish al-Mahdi in Iraq, later by Hashd al-Sha'bi. Qatar played a very significant role. And what we know is, after assassination of General Soleimani, the commander of Iran's what force of Revolutionary Guard, the new commander, General Qa'ani, had experience in Afghanistan. He was responsible for Afghanistan cases desk in the Revolutionary Guard. And actually it helped them to go for a deeper relation with Taliban. So at the same time that we had a Doha negotiation, you know, between United States and Taliban, actually we had a parallel negotiation, like an iceberg. We can see at the left, finally after Doha, we had a meeting between Mullah Abdel al-Ghali Baradar and Mohammad Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister. But the real negotiation actually took place before. And there was an understanding about the post-transition government between Iran and Taliban. So let's come back to what's going on now. Short-term developments after August 2021. So unlike Western embassies, Iran's embassy in Kabul, as well as its consulate in Taliban-controlled Iran, remained fully open and operational. Iran did not support Ahmad Massoud, son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, and what we call Panjshir resistance. Taliban guaranteed the security of Muharram rituals performed by Shia community. And we know that there are some cooperation against ISIS, despite, as Dr. Suther mentioned, shortcomings in terms of security. And finally, Taliban unblocks flow of Hirman River into Iran. So is it the end? No, we know that this is just the beginning. And there are lots of other variables that play a significant role in determining the future.
You'll have to stop here, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, apologies to our qualified panelists for my requesting you to finish your presentation. On that note, let me invite Dr. Jonna Blank. I think along with the introduction that Professor Mukherjee gave us, let me add that Dr. Blank, Jonna Blank, was the policy director in the US Foreign Relations Committee for an extended period. It was almost 12 years when Senator Biden was the chairman. So I think he has a lot of contribution to make in our understanding of what is the way ahead. On that note, can I request Dr. Blank to join us and make his remarks? Jonna?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Uday. Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, everyone else. And I will try to abbreviate my remarks so we can spend more time on the discussion. I'll start out with two notes of scene setting about the present and then move to the future. So on the present, two very brief notes. One is, I do not think that we can expect the Taliban of today to be markedly different from the Taliban of the 1990s. They will be different in their tactics. They will be smarter. They will have learned from their past mistakes. But I don't think we should expect them to be so-called moderate in any way. I at least have seen no indication that that is occurring. Second point is one of the data that we have to understand them. And here I'm putting on my anthropologist hat. We know very little about most of the Taliban's leadership because most of them have spent much of the past 2 decades underground. Even those who have come above ground and been at Doha have really played their cards very close to the vest. One of the things we do know about them, however, is their specific tribe and clan affiliations. And I've been doing some work on this at NUS that I haven't published yet, but the shorthand is that Afghan politics, whether we're talking about during the years of the monarchy, during the years of communist rule, during the warlord years, first Taliban regime, the quasi-democratic or democratic pattern government that we've seen for the past 20 years, in each of these cases, a lot of the politics that look like they are democratic or communist or royalist or whatever you want to call them, have actually been tribe or clan based, playing out in whatever form happens to be available. And I think we can expect to see this in the future too. And that's why looking at the specific Qawm, often translated as tribe or tribal confederacy or super tribe, and Kel, often translated as clan or tribe or sub-tribe, affiliations of the different Taliban leaders is really quite enlightening. The conclusion that I've drawn is that we're seeing a real schism between North and East. And this tracks pretty closely with traditional schisms between the Duranis and the Ghilzais, but not exactly. And the biggest change is one that we've had some panelists talk about, and many analysts have noted, is the rise of the Haqqanis, who are basically an Eastern group. What I've noted in looking at exactly where the different leaders come from is not that there are so many members of the Zadran Kel, that is the community that the Haqqanis come from, but what I would term Haqqanis by adoption, that is people who have gotten their education at the Haqqani madrasa. And it should be noted, a lot of people are under the impression that the Haqqani madrasa takes its name from the Haqqani clan. It's exactly the opposite. The Haqqani clan takes its name from the Haqqani madrasa. But nowadays, I think we should assume that anyone who voluntarily takes the name Haqqani is making a political statement as well as a theological one. And if you look at who has done that, that's not just the blood relatives of Sirajuddin Haqqani and Jalaluddin Haqqani, but that's a whole lot of the Taliban's leadership that I think presumptively can be assumed to be affiliated with them. Those are my comments about the past. For the future, here's what I would say as a point of jumping off for discussion. I encourage all of the outside parties who are trying to think how to interact with the Taliban in the future to learn from the mistakes that we in the United States have made and that I personally have made. I was Joe Biden's Afghanistan advisor from 1999 until 2009, and John Kerry is policy advisor on the same portfolio from 2009 until 2012. I also covered all of South Asia and Southeast Asia, but Afghanistan naturally took up a big portion of this. And one of my big takeaways is that we by that I mean the policymaking community, has to be really clear about its objectives, because those objectives will spiral. Joe Biden was pretty clear from day one that his goal was counterterrorism. But even with that clarity, we found both his own personal goals, but more importantly, the US government goals spiraling in a lot of different directions. Setting Joe Biden aside for a moment, the US government policy objectives went from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency to nation building, protection of women, protection of minorities, protection of human rights, achieving a stable balance in Afghanistan and among the neocons in America, of which I definitely am not a part, having a test case for Iraq and even for Iran. All of this is really a multi-decade colonial enterprise. It would not have been successful even if the US had spent more than the $2 trillion that we did spend. And having been part of this, having been the guy who wrote Joe Biden's speech advocating the first $1 billion in humanitarian aid, I can say that this is a difficult thing. What do I wish I'd done differently? Well, I still believe that humanitarianism and defense of human rights are such moral imperatives that they should not simply be ruthlessly set aside. And I think that most countries have a core national interest in counterterrorism. But beyond those, I would encourage policymakers to really be hard-edged and to push against mission creep wherever they can, because it will happen and it will come across in a form that is very difficult politically to avoid, and even at a personal level will involve some really difficult choices that all of us who are in the policymaking arena or advising those who are will be very hard pressed to draw close lines. And with that, I'm going to end my time early because I really want to get into a discussion with the audience members.
Thank you, Jonah.
Thank
I
you.
think you have finished ahead of time. And given the fact that you had so much to share, I think your last point about learning from the mistakes of the past, and especially those who have actively contributed to policy making, this is a very valuable input, I think, about mission creep, while keeping the moral imperative, the phrase that you have used about the humanitarian dimension. But let me say, I don't want to be cynical, but when we review what happened over the last week, literally, which is the Delhi dialogue, and what happened in Islamabad as the Troika Plus, one didn't get a sense that there was any kind of consensus about providing the kind of urgent humanitarian help while setting aside a series and layered political dissonances. But that's my view. I'm just sharing that, saying that what you have said is, I think, a very clear sense of the imperative, the moral imperative. Will it happen or not? Let me turn to our diplomat on the panel, Ambassador Rakesh Sood. I think, as Professor Mukherjee pointed out, he was India's ambassador to Kabul at a very critical time, 2005 to 8. And since then, he's been a very astute Afghan watcher. So Rakesh, Ambassador Sood, can I invite you to make your comments? Over to you.
Thank you, Uday. And let me also thank Professor Mukherjee for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished panel. We've heard some excellent presentations. So I think what I will do is that I will just make a few points and some observations on what has been said. The first point is that I think that the fact that the Taliban returned to power is hardly a surprise, because let's just go back to the Doha agreement. I mean, even at that time, I had written that it is nothing more than a withdrawal agreement in return for safe passage. And today, everybody is sort of saying the same thing. But yet, after the Doha agreement was signed, 10 days later, the UN Security Council endorsed it by consensus, and everybody said that it was the beginning of a peace agreement. That is what is called collective delusion, self-delusion. Why did that happen? And this is why I think, and it's worth asking that question. Why? I mean, after all these seasoned diplomats and so on, I mean, why did people delude themselves into thinking that this was a peace agreement? The reason is that, I mean, I would suggest that the reason is that because the US and the rest of the West all wanted out, and this was one way of getting out. I mean, they didn't bargain for such a messy withdrawal. That's a different matter. But they want to get out. The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Pakistanis wanted the Americans out. So everybody said, oh, what a wonderful thing. This is a great peace agreement. And the Taliban obviously wanted the US out. So, and that's it. Now, the Taliban played their cards beautifully, both in the Doha negotiations as well as in the on the military field in Afghanistan. So that's one. And I think that unless we sort of start looking at reality and calling a spade, we'll end up making these mistakes. As part of the run-up of this Doha agreement was this another myth that got created, like the myth of Doha being a peace agreement. The Taliban 2.0. I mean, we still have to, yes, I mean, I agree that the Taliban today is different from the Taliban of 1990s. At that time, the Taliban was a politically unknown entity. It was a militarily untested entity, and it had a unified chain of command under Mullah. Today, it is politically known, very savvy, very experienced, and so on. In that sense, after all, they ran the government, they have sustained an insurgency and all that. It is militarily tested. It has successfully run an insurgency. And the only thing is that the unified command is a bit lacking at this moment, because they have had so many other entities fighting with them to get the Americans out, whether it is the Uyghurs, whether it is the Tajiks, whether it is the TTP, whether it is the Uzbeks and so on, that whether it is even the IS. So now to expect that their comrades in arms are now going to suddenly retire from fighting and go and learn how to play golf or something like that is a bit tough. I mean, so, and particularly when there are no resources to be spread around. So obviously, that leaves us with a fairly bleak prospect. A second thing is that why can't the Taliban govern? Well, I mean, so far we have seen in terms of political Islam, you've seen one is the Wahhabi model, which you see represented by in Saudi Arabia. Then, of course, you have the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the other manifestation of political Islam. And then you have the Salafi Jihadi distortion, which is essentially what the IS and the Taliban represent. And at no stage has there been any indication that the Taliban have changed their ideology. I mean, the maximum that people say is, okay, Taliban don't have a global agenda. But then, you know, their ideology is the same ideology that motivates those who have a global agenda. And certainly, as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, their ties are extremely, extremely close. They may have differences of opinion with regard to the Islamic State today, but certainly not with Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda continues to be very much part of their whole network, where there are now marital relationships and all of that. Some things that, and that is why I think that the Taliban will be unable to set up a governance. I mean, you know, once I had a discussion with some of the Taliban leaders in Herat, and I was asking them at that time, they talked about the fact that, well, you know, maybe we can't accept a republic, but there can't be an emirate, so there has to be a via media, a republic that is not an emirate, and an emirate that is not a republic. I mean, it's a little bit like the Doha Agreement, which says this is an agreement between the United States and the Islamic Republic, Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan, which is not recognized, which is otherwise known as the Taliban. I mean, you have that phrase in the title of that agreement. So, I mean, but you can't either it is a cat or it is a dog. I mean, you can't have something in between. I mean, one of the things, and the US made a hell of a lot of mistakes right from the beginning. I mean, from the time that the Taliban offered to surrender and Rumsfeld said nothing doing, to everything else, the Tora Bora fiasco, because General Tommy Franks has been asked to prepare plans for Iraq and all the rest of it, and so on and so on, to a highly centralized constitution, which without the system of checks and balances, to, as Jonah said, from counterterrorism to counterinsurgency to nation building. Nation building was right from the beginning. When you write a new constitution, when you put in, when you create elections, when you set up a new parliament, when you set up a new judiciary, when you set up a new army, a new police. I mean, if that is not nation building, then what the hell is it? I mean, so to keep saying every successive president said we are not in the business of nation building, and that's precisely. So this is again part of the myth making and self-delusion that I said, you know, is what has created the kind of mess. Now, even while the US has been responsible for creating all these kind of messes, the fact is that doesn't take away from the fact that Pakistan's duplicity in terms of running with the hare and hunting with the hounds, of being a frontline state and then providing shelter and sanctuary to the Taliban, even as they pursued the insurgency, is something that you can't get away from. And that is where I would say that I don't think anything has changed, because the only thing that is slightly different, and Jonah hinted at that, is in terms of the tribals, because so far tribal affinities within Afghanistan, so far, you see, it is the Mohammadzais, the Barakzais, and the Duranis, these three Zirak tribes that have traditionally been the rulers. So today, not only are they upset, but even among a lot of Ghilzais, the Zadrans are seen as bottom of the pile, and they can't be calling the shots to the extent that they are. And that again creates, from what I hear, certain amount of resentment and ill will. Now, why does Pakistan...
You have 2 minutes to wrap up, huh? Sorry.
Yeah. Last point today. Why does Pakistan play in this kind of thing? I think that Pakistan has always been more comfortable working with Islamist Pashtuns rather than nationalist Pashtuns. And that is why it picks and chooses. I mean, whether it was during the time of, even during the time of the Mujahideen, it was much more the Ghilzais. This time it was also among the Ghilzais, the Zadrans, and some of the other tribes. And that is also reflected in their own society, because they are uncomfortable working with ANP. They would rather work with the likes of Fazlur Rahman and Samuel and the late Samuel Haq and all of that. And that is why you see the manifestation of PTM and so on. So it is the nationalist Pashtun ethos somehow or the other runs counter to Pakistan's perception, self-perception of its own interest in that region, the AFPAC region. So given that, my last point, why can't the region come together? Because within Afghanistan, there is disunity. Within the region, there is disunity. And naturally, therefore, at a wider global level, you have that disunity. And the Taliban are unlikely to form an inclusive representative government because they think they have won. They have won militarily. So it's a little bit like when the US was blamed for excluding the Taliban by the Pakistanis at Bonn 1. The Taliban are making exactly the same mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. And again, let me thank all the panelists for making some very valuable remarks, even as I apologize for nudging you all to stay within that time limit. The reason really was for us to be able to have a discussion with our participants. And, you know, Ambassador Sood has identified the constraints, the disunity within Afghanistan, within the region. So I want to try and direct our attention now to the most urgent humanitarian crisis, which is, can food and medical aid be reached to Afghanistan in such a way that it can be distributed, which is what I think is the most urgent requirement. And I'm going to toss this over to our participants to say that since everybody else has been inadequate in their policy responses for very good domestic and other political reasons, Germany, the European Union, while you have your hands full with lots of developments within Europe, is there anything that could be done to bring 1 million tons of food or urgent medicines and ensure that they are distributed through available networks before the winter sets in? And I thought that's something we might want to discuss. I'll request Professor Mukherjee to help us with the chat box, and I will throw the floor open, the house open, and request you to identify yourselves and either ask a sharp question or make an observation. I'm not sure about the time constraints, but I think we have about 30 minutes. But Rahul, over to you. You might want to give us a sense about the time management and how do you want to do the chat box? Rahul?
Yeah, certainly. I think we have an outer limit of 30 minutes. Normally our meetings end at 3:45, which is about 13 or 14 minutes from now, but we can extend it till 4 o'clock. So we have about 20 3 minutes, and I think we should give it that much time considering, all the matters that have been discussed. So I think, Kaunda Bhaskar, you can certainly continue to moderate the discussion. I will nudge you in the direction of some question if I can see a hand or two. And
I'm unable to see them, so if you can identify them, then we can.
Okay. So basically, we have, I think Professor Harun Rashid has a first question. Then there is Mr. Anish Mishra and Mr. Tarun Das, in that order. So, Professor Rashid.
You hear me, please? You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Please go ahead. Yes.
Yes, I have just two questions. My first question is to Professor Omar Suther. While he was making his deliberation, he categorically mentioned that these Taliban forces would not be able to provide security or would not be able to take care of economic welfare of the people. Finally, they will be ended in a should I say, they will be rather will be failure. If that is so, then what kind of future you see in Afghanistan? If this will lead to further crisis, then does it mean that Afghanistan will go through perpetual crisis and there will be no settlement of the political issues and there will be no stability? Or only Afghanistan is destined to live with political instability? So what kind of future do you see in Afghanistan? This is my first question to Professor Omar Suther. And my second and then the last question to Mr. Dr. Blanc. Dr. Blanc, do you think, you have been the advisor to the current president at that time, he was not the president, Joe Biden. Do you think that the abrupt withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan was a mistake? And why should US fail to influence a liberal democratic political system in Afghanistan during its history for about 20 years? Does it mean that there is no prospect or any hope for democracy in Afghanistan? My first question is.
Excuse me, Professor Rashid.
Yes.
I think part of your question, second question is not clear.
Oh, my second question is, do you think?
Can you go a little bit back and speak? You are fine when you're speaking. Yeah.
My second question is to Dr. Blanc, meaning, do you think that the abrupt withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan a mistake? First part of this question, and second part is, why should US fail to introduce a democratic political system in Afghanistan despite of being here for 20 years? Okay.
Jonah, did you get the question? You have to unmute, please.
Yes, I got enough of it.
Okay, great. Now, would you like to take these questions first, and then should we move on to, I can see, or should we take a couple of more questions?
Rahul, may I suggest we take two more questions and let
sure.
the panelists bunch them together?
Sure. So, Anish, a quick, brief question, because there are lots of questions, and then we'll request Mr. Basu to make comments and ask his question. Yes, Anish.
He'll have to unmute, Anish.
Anish, can you hear me?
He'll have to unmute, yeah.
Somehow okay, that's fine. Then we move on to Mr. Tarun Basu.
Thank you, Rahul. I think it has been an excellent presentation from all the panelists in terms of the broad sweep of the issues involved in this whole Afghanistan crisis. And in terms of the perspectives, I was looking at it, in terms of the regional players, we have the Afghan perspective, we have the Pakistani perspective, we had the Iranian perspective, and we had the Indian perspective, and in some ways the American perspectives. So only of all the regional players involved, only the Russian and the Chinese were perhaps missing. Now, referring to the presentation by the Professor Dr. Asim Akhtar, the Quaid Azam University, he talked about it, if I heard him correctly, that Pakistan is at the front and center of this whole, situation, and so is India, and that the Pakistan has to move beyond strategic depth, and there should be an attempt to have a kind of a regional solution to this whole thing. I don't know whether he meant it that way. Now, I would, from that question, referring from Dr. Asim Akhtar, I would also go to Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who, I happen to know for a long, long time. In terms of the two security dialogues, the Delhi Security Dialogue and the Troika Plus, do you think India has been left somehow high and dry out of this whole attempt to find a regional solution? Because while the Delhi dialogue was attended by the Central Asians and the Russians, the key players, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, the Afghans, and the Americans, they were not there, and they were there in the Islamabad dialogue. So has Pakistan not stolen a march over India? And where does that leave India in terms of that India did it not put all its eggs in the Ghani basket, and so lost out in the so-called race to find a foothold in Afghanistan that is evolving post-August 15. So if both Dr. Akhtar and Ambassador Sood could talk about it.
Now I can see Dr. Christian Wagner's hand raised, but I think we will take his question and also his comments regarding Germany, I think, after the first set of questions, because do you have a related question, Christian? Okay, then maybe your comments about Germany will come in later, but you can raise your question right now.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me also, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you also very much for the excellent inputs, which gave a very good picture on the situation. I have two comments. One, I think one should keep in mind, and this is why it relates to the last question, that the Taliban today have a much more suitable regional environment. Keep in mind, we no longer have a debate about a Northern Alliance kind of resistance that we had in the 1990s. So I think the Taliban were quite smart to establish a consensus among the neighbors when they give certain security promises regarding militant groups. They would get the consent of the neighboring countries, including Russia, China, and the Central Asian republics. Second point, I think this limits also the options for the Western countries, because the West, of course, has a very broad agenda when it wants to deal with the Taliban, whereas the neighbors, I think, are quite satisfied if security guarantees can be met. So I think we may see the challenge that the neighboring countries make their own or find their own approach with the Taliban, which of course will limit also options for the West. The humanitarian points is not included here because I think this will be dealt with by the international community and international donor organizations, but we can discuss this later. Thank you.
Rahul, before we request the panelists, there are two questions which are related. You might want to read them out, or if you wish, I can read them out, relating to SARC and so on. Should we take them on board and then let the panelists respond? I think Rahul is muted. So if the panelists can hear me, I'm going to read out a question from Saroj Kumar, which is what is the possibility of reviving SARC to work together in Afghanistan? And does India have any intention of reviving SARC? I think this could perhaps be addressed by Ambassador Sood. And a related question is, what is the ground for the negotiations between India and the Taliban-led government? Is there any possibility of bilateral engagement / cooperation between the Taliban and India? So these two have come into the question box. So on that note, I'll request our panelists to respond. And in the interest of time, we may not have enough time for another round. Why don't we go in the same order? I'll request Professor Omar Suther to go first and take a couple of minutes and respond if you have any thing to add to the discussion. Omar, all yours.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the questions which was addressed to me about the current, probably what sort of scenarios we will face in future as Taliban fail to govern, but also they are not recognized, and many other challenges. I think, unfortunately, the world and region has taken for granted Afghanistan and the Taliban. And to a large extent, as the West failed in Afghanistan, they also do not have any interest again to come back. Of course, we know from the experience of 90s that there are two possible scenarios which may lead to any kind of international intervention. One is humanitarian disaster as a result of state failure. The second one is threat to international security from the collapsed states. And I think both of them are now viable in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a failed state, and of course, it will pose an international security threat. Secondly, already we have spoken about humanitarian catastrophe. However, there is no possibility of international intervention to prevent further crisis in Afghanistan. So that's why, as region is engaging with the Taliban, West is not interested to intervene in Afghanistan, and it has failed in the last 20 years. Thirdly, unfortunately, there has not been any viable resistance against the Taliban. Of course, the National Resistance Front has politically established a rhetoric, a narrative against the Taliban. However, the front in Baghlan and Panjshir was not able to hold against the Taliban. So I think it will take a bit of time for any forms of resistance to stand against the Taliban. Well, they are not doing well in terms of governance, yes. Taliban are not able to manage economics, yes. They are ethno-majoritarianists, they are radical supremacists, yes. But I do not see any possible change in near future because there's not enough foundations to change that. Yeah.
Thanks, Omar. I'm sorry, I'm requesting you to hold your thoughts on that. Can I request Dr. Asim Akhtar to come in now and respond to any of the questions, observations made to him?
Yes, thank you. I'll try and be brief. What I heard being asked of myself was this question of regional sort of cooperation. Look, I think that I make a general point. And of course, there's simply no two ways about it. I mean, the elephant in the room is the way in which Pakistan and India are sort of both, implicated in this sense that Pakistan, as the ambassador said, was running with the hare and playing with the hound. Certainly, yes. And India was, of course, perhaps the most prominent backer of the Ghani regime, invested the best part of $3 billion in infrastructure and so on. And when I said earlier that the Pakistani establishment and the intelligentsia were sort of jumping up and down besides themselves on 15th August, it was because strategic depth came at the cost of India, essentially. And I think that is precisely what I'm saying, is if these are the sorts of one-upsmanships that are going to guide the way in which, whether it's this particular iteration of the Taliban regime, in a sense, are going to guide future engagements with whoever's in power in Kabul, then I don't see, quite aside from the immediate question of whether there's an alternative, I don't see, in fact, even in the medium and long run, this cycle of violence and war being displaced by some kind of sort of stable regime. And when that's what I'm saying when I'm saying that, you know, a regional solution has to be found. I mean, that can't be with 2 or 4 or 6 or you know, anyone being left out of any particular settlement will therefore then be on the outside, any regional country that is. And that includes, even despite the limited, I heard that point being made about the limited bargaining power that the West enjoys, but that includes the West in general. I also want to very briefly, because there are these 2 questions and I want to make sure I answer them, that Anish Mishra has written in the chat box. And both of them reflect on the role that Pakistan has played historically and in the contemporary period in nurturing this particular, and I do agree with everyone who's saying that Taliban 2.0, at least in its ideology and its sort of basic policy principles, is not that distinct from Taliban 1.0. Why has Pakistan nurtured them, or why are there rank and file sort of training grounds in Pakistan? Well, because historically that's, of course, where most of, at least the Taliban as refugees, you know, in Peshawar and in and around, as was pointed out, in and around the Akora Khatak Madrasa and the larger sort of ideological training ground, which was Pakistan. And the other question about the TTP, well, I mean, the TTP, a bunch of the Tehreek-e-Taliban, sort of a lot of Tehreek-e-Taliban sort of rank and file and leadership were immediately freed right after the takeover of Kabul. And of course, there is this long-term story of the Pakistani state and what kind of state it wants to be. And a point was made about Pakistan being more comfortable with Islamists rather than secular nationalists. That is all true. And that's why I said, ultimately, as far as Pakistan is concerned, I think similar sort of stories would apply to each of the regional countries. Every country will have to determine how it sees an engagement with a radical Islamist regime, and whether it is possible to do so and the extent to which, you know, all mutual interests are met in doing so. But as far as Pakistan's current regime is concerned, it's clearly made, you know, it's no different in a sense, insofar as Islamism as a foreign policy tool and as a domestic policy tool to neuter opposition continues to be the name of the game. And I think that is destructive not only for Afghanistan, but for Pakistan itself. And I think
Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting you again. Dr. Zarhani, can I request you, sir, to come in and make your comments on some of the questions that were raised? Dr. Zarhani, can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you. There is no question addressed to me. I think I will give the opportunity to other respected panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Zarhani. That's very generous of you. Dr. Jonna Blank, can I request you, sir, to come in and, you know, share your thoughts about the way ahead? Can food reach the Afghans? I think that's what everyone is wondering. Jonna?
Yes. Can food reach the Afghans? I believe so. I think that if the international community can provide food aid to North Korea, a horrific regime that was supported with food aid during a famine of the 1990s, then I think that the international community can indeed find a way of getting food to the Afghan people so that they do not starve. At least I certainly hope that they can, and I believe that they can. I also will address Professor Rashid's question to me, which was about the withdrawal, the abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan, and whether that had a bad impact on the outcome. And I believe that it did. I strongly supported the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. I believe it was over a decade too late. I was with Joe Biden in January of 2009 when he reached the conclusion that it was time to withdraw from Afghanistan. And I think it was the right decision. However, I think that the way it was carried out was tragic and unnecessary and really led to a much worse situation than if it had been carried out in a better way. Now, we should really take a step back and remember that the Doha Agreement that President Biden's predecessor, Mr. Trump, agreed to was, as Ambassador Sood quite rightly says, this was simply not a peace agreement, but was an agreement to withdraw in exchange for essentially a controlled retreat. I would say it was basically a surrender to the Taliban. I do not think that Donald Trump should have negotiated that agreement. However, that was the agreement that Joe Biden inherited. Joe Biden could have done, in my view, a much better job of executing the withdrawal. But the ultimate decision to withdraw, in my view, probably would have led to a Taliban takeover, whether in a controlled way or an uncontrolled way.
Thank you, Jana, for those responses. Now, can I request Ambassador Sood to make his remarks? Rakesh?
Thanks, Uday. Let me just say that in terms of, you asked about the two conferences in Islamabad and in Delhi, and there was an earlier one, foreign minister level in Tehran. India was not invited to that, and so on. And there have been other meetings in Moscow and so on. See, the thing is that it is true, as Tarun said, we put all our eggs in one basket. I think it was entirely stupid. I mean, I think for the last 7-8 years, the writing has been on the wall, because after all, the process of legitimization of the Taliban began. Once it didn't begin when the Doha Agreement was signed. It didn't begin in 2018 when US engaged in direct talks. It began way back when the talks began to open an international office in Doha. I mean, what else? How else will you read it? So in a sense, Pakistan, in this sense, was somebody said that even the Taliban don't enjoy legitimacy. Well, the Taliban actually enjoy a fair bit of legitimacy. They don't enjoy official recognition because everybody is engaging with them. And that process of legitimacy has come about because of Doha, and so the Taliban have traveled to Moscow, they've traveled to China, they've traveled to Tehran, they've traveled to Saudi Arabia, I mean, they've traveled to Europe, everywhere. So in a sense, there is a degree of legitimacy that the Taliban have enjoyed. Now, whether they can retain it is the question. So regional approach, I don't think there is any scope for a regional approach. I mean, it's not so far back when the Taliban couldn't form their government. You didn't have a political delegation going from Pakistan. You had the ISI Director General Lieutenant Faiz Hamid going there, and 2 days later, wow, the first Taliban sort of administration or the cabinet, etc., gets announced. I mean, so in a sense, there is India and Pakistan not in the same boat. We closed our embassy within 24 hours of the Taliban reaching Kabul because we realized that we had no locus standi. We were banking on the American presence. There was no American presence. We were banking on the Ghani regime. There was no Ghani regime. So obviously, given that, now, there was one question about, can we negotiate with the Taliban? Sure. I mean, the Taliban have made a lot of positive noises. But having closed our embassy, now the hurdle, the emotional hurdle, the intellectual hurdle of going back to open your embassy, even in a limited strength or whatever it is, becomes that much greater. And let's not forget, it is partly because of the Haqqani network. The Haqqanis control a large chunk, including the Interior Ministry, some of the intelligence services, etc. And 2008, when the Indian embassy was attacked, where we lost the military advisor, we lost our political counselor, and we lost a number of boys from the security, ITBP, along with about 40-50 innocent Afghans who were just hanging around. It was a major attack on 7th of July 2008, and that was carried out by the Haqqani network. So that is what creates, I think the Taliban would like India to be back. But whether India can take the Taliban assurances or not is a matter. Then, of course, there is the domestic Indian angle to it. And I mean, I think everybody knows here that the Modi government has a certain view, and Therefore, that is also partly reflected. And that's how the things are. SARC, I'm afraid, SARC, I would say 0.
Yeah. Thanks. I was about to say that that's a non-starter, but thank you so much, Ambassador Sood, for those very, I would say, useful remarks about what are the issues that could be considered. I'm looking at the watch. We're literally 1 minute away from the time that I will turn into a pumpkin, because that's what Rahul Mukherjee told me. So Rahul, let me hand this over to you and allow me just one last line to thank our panelists for some very valuable remarks, and all the participants. We still have 32 of them in there. Thank you very much, participants, and thank you, panelists. And anybody who wants to write, and if I have not allowed you to express your thoughts, please feel free to write for the South Asia Monitor, 800 words, and we'll be happy to hoist you. But on that note, Professor Mukherjee, all yours. Thank you for giving Sam an opportunity to be part of this discussion. Rahul?
Yeah, thank you. I would rather say that thank you for giving us the opportunity to partner in this dialogue. As you can see, one of my colleagues from Iran was already quite excited about these events, and we were having these discussions. And then very quickly, when I mentioned to Mr. Tarun Das, who actually we had the good fortune of welcoming in Heidelberg a couple of years ago, he sort of jumped at it and said that, no, we must have this dialogue. And then, of course, when we added the social capital of South Asia Monitor and the University of Heidelberg together, we have seen what a rich discussion we have been able to have. I would have requested Dr. Wagner to say a few words about German foreign policy, but we've just run out of time. Thank you very much, the panelists, Mr. Basu, and of course, Commodore Bhaskar, for holding the weight of this dialogue, because as you know, I am not the greatest authority on Afghanistan. I have learned a lot. I must say that I go back sad that Afghanistan continues to be a territory which is used as a buffer for the conflicts that great powers have played, and international negotiation has certainly not moved in a direction where one could see a ray of hope. I must say that this dialogue was a great one. It was very enlightening. We did get to the root of many issues, but hope and despair still sort of seem like clouds that will not easily go away. I must also thank my colleagues in the department whom I introduced before we began this session. They have certainly helped to make this event what it has become. It's almost never a panel discussion. It's almost always a seminar presentation. So we will have one other sort of policy-oriented seminar presentation by Ambassador Sham Saran, who will be talking about India's climate policies a couple of weeks from now. But this has been a very lively seminar series. Sometimes it can be a policy-oriented discussion, and we look forward to further collaboration with South Asia Monitor and the Society for Policy Studies. Thank you very much, audience, participants, speakers, and please keep joining us whenever you feel that it is a lively discussion and relevant for your academic or other appetite. So with that, I will close the session now. We are running out of time, and hopefully we will remain in touch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye, Rahul.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Rahul.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Christian.
Thank you, Uday.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Rahul. Thanks. It's wonderful.
Please write for Sam, those who want to write.
Thank you.
Yeah.